Welcome, welcome. I'm so glad to be in this summer series of the parables. There are so many of you who were here last week. You know Branch's style. It's like maybe 50% of you are here 50% of the time, and that's okay. That means half of you weren't here last week, maybe, and it's the launching of our summer series of the parables of Jesus. We're calling them Kingdom Parables. And for those that were here, a slight recap. Parables are challenging because they're these vignettes of metaphor and art. And we use the analogy of art to talk about the ways that paradox of parables means that they're revealing something and concealing something at the same time. You have this sense of it hiding and revealing, and they're not meant to comfort you. I would love to have messages throughout the whole summer that give us the warm and fuzzies and to go home feeling encouraged and really good. But it's hard because these parables, they confront, they mess with you. They leave you asking more questions than you had going in, and in many ways, that's the point. The point of Jesus' parables was not to, if you recall, have an instruction manual like an IKEA building instructions, but it's more akin to the way that you would meditate on great art and great story. Things are revealed sometimes days, weeks, years later. Something is revealed through it and in you. And so we're going to continue in these parables in Matthew. Last week was the sower and the soil and the rocks and the birds and the thorns and the thistles and the good soil. We find ourselves this week in the parable of the wheat and the tares. Where's my reader this morning? Kyle, you with us? I'm going to bring Kyle on up. So, as we did last week with Anna, this week it's Kyle. He's going to read through the parable. I'm going to encourage you not to actually kind of get on your phones, on your Bibles, but listen to him as he says the parable, because it would have been more akin to how it would have been heard. You would have listened to this spoken over you. And because we're bouncing around a little bit and not following the parable just purely linearly throughout the scriptures. So, take it away, Kyle.
Hey, morning, everyone. This is Matthew 13, 24 through 43. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, 'First collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parables of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. As weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear."
Thank you, Kyle. Great job. So what do we do about evil in our world, in our community, in our church, in ourselves? Jesus answers with a strange story, another strange parable, and an even stranger command: let them grow together. In a world eager to sort and fix and judge, Jesus calls us to some form of radical patience through a story of wheat and weeds. Some of your Bibles say tares. It's the same thing. He's redefining how we confront evil, not with power, not with control, but with presence and patience, not by uprooting, but by trusting. So let's dig into it. I have lots of observations on this parable, 6 or 7 different points in here. But First observation is this bad farming or a better kingdom strategy? Bad farming, I think, yes. He says, a kingdom is like a man who sowed good seeds, but an enemy comes and sows the weeds. And the servants say, we should pull him up, right? And the master says, no. Why? Because you're going to destroy the wheat. The thing is weeds are a real problem in real farming. It's a real thing to be dealt with and a serious threat. The only thing I really know about farming, I know from Clarkson's Farm. Anybody ever watch that show? It's Jeremy Clarkson has a farm now, and he's a terrible farmer, and like I would probably be. And one of the episodes is an episode of the mysterious weeds that pop up on the field of wheat that's like the biggest deal and a major bummer. In wheat fields, a common weed is known as tares or darnel. Some of yours has a heading in your passage. It says the parable of the wheat and tares. And the thing about darnel, this weed, is it looks identical to wheat. And it's toxic. And it intermingles with the roots of the wheat. And it's terrible for your animals. It'll kill them. And it'll contaminate your whole harvest. So in real farming, listeners listening to Jesus would have been saying, this is bad farming. Might even be thinking, that's kind of stupid. The weeds compete and entangle and spoil, unless they leaned in a little bit further and thought, well, wait a minute, is this or isn't this about farming? What if it's not about farming then? What if he's revealing something deeper about control or trust, restraint? And maybe the most confusing thing about this parable is it's confronting the listeners and the servants and the disciples and now us that the kingdom methods are highly, highly inefficient. They're not efficient methods, that the kingdom is not a straight path from A to B. It just isn't. It's really inefficient. My second observation, before we dig into the meat of this, is that if some of you just pause and say, well, what's the kingdom like? I say, the kingdom is like a field full of weeds, and it grows while you sleep. That should be jarring. Jesus saying, the kingdom, his kingdom, the kingdom is a field full of weeds, and it grows while you sleep. That should give me a lot of pause about the impact of what I do here. It says that in verse 25. While everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. Jesus says the weeds are sown while everyone was sleeping. Now, this isn't napping on the job. This isn't laziness or describing a farmer that's just kind of off and had a few too many, decided to sleep it off. This is while everyone's sleeping, saying that while everybody sleeps is when the kingdom's doing its thing. The mystery of the kingdom is that it will and does fend nicely for itself while you sleep. And this is different than last week. Last week, if you remember, there was a distinct impression that the seed is in danger by birds and stones, by the sun, by thorns and weeds, that the weeds are a danger to the seed. Fascinating that we have another side of the same coin, that the seed is not in any danger in this parable. That the wheat will grow. Now, what is in danger, what he is highlighting that is in danger, is our patience, is what's in danger. What's in danger is our incessant need to intervene, to take control, to fix everything now. That's what's at threat. Third observation. If these weeds are evil, evil is a counterfeit, not co-equal power. I mentioned that darnel isn't just annoying, it's deceptive. When it's young, you can't tell the difference between the weed and the wheat. It's this indistinguishable plant, and that's what makes it so dangerous. They actually called it false wheat, was the name of it. And It was particularly toxic so that either it was dangerous in the rooting up process, or dangerous to those who were consuming the harvest if you didn't get it out right, or dangerous to your animals if you just let it go and they were going to graze on the fields. It was such a big deal that it was illegal to sow. It was a source of sabotage. If you wanted to really get after your neighbor, you would sow false wheat. So much so that in Rome it's a crime that they had to have punishable by law, because obviously it happened more than enough times that if you were really wanting to screw your neighbor, you sow false wheat. So the hearers of this would have been listening to Jesus, and what we hear is this story of confusing farming, but what they hear, and why I said last week context matters, why we talked about Kirsten's painting and the context of the painting matters. It adds to the beauty of it. It enhances the depth of meaning. The context here matters because the listeners would have been listening to Jesus, and what they're hearing is some guy, probably your enemy, went out to your field and was sabotaging you as an act of malice and destruction and causing real damage. You have an enemy, and he's screwing you. That's how they would have heard it. But Jesus is saying that the real problem isn't the weeds. The real problem is how the servants want to respond. He's saying all they will accomplish by this frantic pulling up of the weeds is the destruction of the wheat. You're the problem, servant. Or that instinct is the problem. Never condemns the enemy or the weeds, actually, in this. And more confusingly, instead of condemning them in that, he basically just says, let them grow together. Again, hearers of that be like, well, it sounds like Joseph kind of really leaned into the carpenter thing for you, Jesus. I don't think he ever taught you about farming. That's bad farming. And it's how you get yourself taken advantage of, because you have an enemy that's sowing false wheat in your field. The sneaky thing here, and my instinct as I'm reading this is to go, you know what's happening, is that Jesus knows what we forget. That evil often works by provoking good intentions, provoking goodness to respond in a way that does harm. Good intentions, they're like the muscle of the enemy. Like the low-end mob muscle that goes out and does the dirty work. That's the good intention. See, the enemy just goes and sprinkles around a generous helping of darkness, weeds, evil, whatever you want to call it. And the people of God get so flustered and so worked up enough to do the job for him that they go out and in the way of eradicating evil and destroying evil, they do the very thing that the enemy can't even do for himself. Why? He's walked away. You notice in the parable how it says he sows the evil and bails because there's nothing left for him to do. He can't do anything else. There's no more that he can do to the people of God. And so what does he do? Confuse the people of God to say, let's go out into the field and destroy it. And in doing that, they become the handiwork of the devil. Get suckered into, in the name of good intentions, trying to judge and separate and weed out the problem, especially if the problem is somebody else. I love how Robert Farrar Capon says in his book, Kingdom Judgment, Grace, Parables, his words here, since the only troops available to fight the battle are either too confused or too busy to recognize the real difference between good and evil, all they will accomplish by their frantic pulling out of the weeds is the tearing up of the wheat right along with them. Worse yet, since good and evil in this world commonly inhabit not only the same field, but even the same person, individual human being, since, that is, there are no unqualified good guys, any more than there are any unqualified bad guys, the only result of a truly dedicated campaign to get rid of evil will be the destruction of literally everyone. The subtle trick is that the intention and instinct, even good intentions, to eradicate evil by using force or destruction or power is often the very thing that causes the most harm. And that's what Jesus is drawing our attention to here. And that's how we can get suckered into doing the devil's handiwork. But there is a word that holds this field together. Aphiemi. This is Jesus saying, let both grow together. And this word, it's a word he's using that's saying, let go, allow, release. But more than that, how it's more often used in the scriptures is forgive. The word is forgive. Forgive them to grow together is what he's saying. How do we know this? Because it shows up in really meaningful places. On Luke 23:34 on the cross, when Jesus looks out amid his torturers, bloody and dying, he says, Aphiemi, forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing. Forgive them. This isn't forgiveness as some kind of closure. It's forgiveness as non-retaliation. Jesus, while abandoned and bleeding, asked the Father to let go of justice. Not to forget, not to excuse, but release the need for justice, God. That's what he's asking God to do. God, release the need for justice. Let go. And he calls that forgiveness. Father, forgive them. Matthew 6:12. Some of you may know where I'm going with this. It's Jesus instructing when they say, how should we pray? And he gives them the Lord's Prayer. And he says, Aphiemi, forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Jesus is centering the people of the kingdom around the daily ritual of letting go. Let it go. Forgive. Release. He's saying, forgive us our debts, our forgiveness we need, as we also forgive. The implications of this is that it's not just emotional closure. It's hard to pin down forgiveness sometimes, and we think of it like sometimes between my wife and I, or things are challenging and there's forgiveness that's needed, and really often what we're after is a kind of emotional closure, which is not wrong. But it's so much deeper in Jesus' use. It's a kind of spiritual defiance against cycles of judgment and violence. It's how God restrains his judgment, and it's how he invites us into that model of restraint and forgiveness. Even when it looks like bad farming, even when it looks stupid. So the listeners are going, that's so stupid, Jesus. It looks like bad farming. It means resisting evil not by uprooting and abolishing, but by trusting God, who is almost never using the most effective or efficient means. It's so on brand. Whether it be the lastborn or the secondborn in Joseph or David, or whether it be the nowheresville nobody from Nazareth who comes in Jesus as a kind of bastard son and gathers a ragtag group of fishermen and tax collectors that people hate and has women following him. He has no power and no political office, has no repute, has no wealth, has no ability to exercise power. He dies and is crucified by the state. He's dead, and his resurrection is first seen and celebrated by whom? The women that come to the tomb. This is not who you would choose as the most effective means, not because women should be diminished, but at that time, my goodness, if you were going to start something, you wouldn't have it start that way. And then the first convert becomes the eunuch on the road, not somebody of who you would write the story about. I mean, it's on and on and on and on. Bad farming after bad farming after bad farming. It doesn't make sense. It is not an efficient means from A to B. The kingdom doesn't work efficiently, but it does work while you sleep. I like how Dale Allison writes here, the refusal to uproot the weeds is not divine indecision, but divine mercy in motion. Patience. Patience. Patience is what was at risk. Patience is what he's calling for. And, boy, is that hard. Isn't it the first thing that's written by Paul when saying love is Patient. Kind of skip over that one, don't we? It's easy to move past that. Like, well, I mean, I can tick that box. It's like that test that they do when they ask a slew of like 1,000 people, are you above average driver? And it's like 98% of them say yes. And it's like, that's not how averages work. Patience is hard. And when I was hearing this and reading this and struggling with it this week, I felt real tension. Because if you're feeling the tension, my fourth point is that, boy, there's tension when patience feels like privilege. Because right now in our world, I am the wrong guy to be advocating for patience. The last thing the world needs is another middle-aged, well-to-do American white guy telling somebody suffering to be patient. How incredibly tone-deaf. Because my patience costs me, it's almost imperceivably nothing. Can you imagine telling a Palestinian child starving to be patient? Can you imagine telling somebody legally here, rounded up by ICE, to be patient? That feels like privilege. And my privilege is because I can walk away. That's the definition of privilege. I can walk away and it doesn't cost me. I think it's right to struggle in this tension. Jesus is advocating for a kind of radical patience, which feels wrong. It feels like you're saying to the hurting, wait, or suffer longer, or keep suffering silently. But if we dig deeper, I think Jesus is not advocating for marginalized to suffer more, suffer longer. This is an affront to the powerful, to those who do have control, to the servants who are given a degree of authority over the field. You are not the judge. To those with the power, you are not the judge. He's confronting powerful here. His words aren't passive. They're a radical call to trust. It does force me to come to grips with these inefficiencies of the kingdom. It seems to confront my issues with outcome and control and measurements and success. But the kingdom is not ideal. Remember, it's a field full of weeds. And so there's tension there. And how do I struggle with this idea of long-suffering, patience? I'm not the judge. And the fact that there is so many hurting and suffering. I've been helped by this book by Alan Creeder called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. It's a historical book chronological about the early church. And it moves through the things that marked their characteristics, their gatherings, their identities, what they were built around. It's a really great read. But the thing that's most fascinating and why it's called the patient ferment of the early church is that the thing that most marked the early church was patience. Not his opinion, but actually theirs. The first treaty ever written by the church by Tertullian was not on dogma or preaching or strategy or politics. It was on patience. So when the early church said, we need to start actually codifying what we're about, who we are, and what is the primary marker when someone comes and joins this community. Because remember, that church wasn't them saying, do you ascribe and tick these mental boxes of what you believe to be true? When you joined the way of Jesus, it was fidelity to a way of life. You were saying, I am joining this way, and my embodied life, my life exists in these rhythms and these practices and these sacrifices and these kinds of ways of treating my neighbor. And the thing that they needed to get to first, and what marked their catechism process, what ultimately became their catechizing, was patience. It was Tertullian writing, the principal work of God is patience. When the Spirit descends, patience is always along for the ride. He goes on and says, God's patience is what holds back judgment. God is not quick to avenge, even when we are. The virtue we need most is the one we want least. Spelling out how the early church's witness flowed not from public preaching or from ascribing to doctrines of faith, but from public patience. The power of their lives, not their arguments, convinced the empire. In a world obsessed with revenge and control, the church was known for its refusal to strike back. So does patience mean we do nothing? Is Jesus saying, forgive them to grow together, do nothing, be passive? No, not if we're following Jesus. But this parable highlights the tension big time. The tension of becoming comfortable with the radical, almost comical inefficiencies of the kingdom, using the least effective means. And it should give you hope, because I'm part of that inefficiency. Maybe a paragon model of the inefficiency. Because, like I said at the beginning, I'm the wrong guy to be giving this message. I'm the wrong guy. I needed to put tangible things on this as I was studying it. Like, man, how do I see this in motion? And I thought of the story of Brian Stevenson and Walter McMillan. Those of you who read the book Just Mercy, I know it became a film. I actually haven't seen it. I hear it's good. But it's a true story about Walter McMillan, who was black and in 1986 was convicted of murder in Alabama of a white woman. He was held on death row. The trial was a bit of a sham. There were a number of witnesses testifying to Walter's presence at church at the moment of the murder. But those were outright ignored. By the time the trial happened, which was all of about a day, this is how long that lasted for a murder trial, it was insane. Trial lasted all of a day. Amid the trial, the police and those that were investigating had coerced and manipulated and threatened other witnesses, another white man also who'd been convicted of a crime, to coerce him to lie and falsely testify and accuse Walter of murder. We know this because it's now on tape. We have the taped coercion because that came out eventually. Brian Stevenson, who started EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, who knew Walter, says we need to do something about this, and so starts the process of the appeals. Now, this is the 80s, and so this was before there was any process, really, of overturning a death sentence. And the truth is the judge during this trial ignores the jury who says we are giving the lesser conviction, and we did convict him of life in prison. The jury says, the judge overturns the jury and says, no, he should be hanged. Sentences him to death for a crime Walter did not commit. And Brian Stevenson spends the next 7 years through the appellate process in courts, through investigative journalism, through acquiring of the tapes and the records that show the manipulation of the courts, to eventually get Walter exonerated after 7 years on death row. Amid that whole time, the attorney Brian is experiencing death threats, threats to his family, threats to his livelihood. Patience for Walter comes at a cost. 7 years in jail. But became a movement. Among the first of the next 160 or so that the Equal Justice Initiative would free of people that were wrongly convicted on death row to be killed. This process of 6 years for Brian, the attorney, tireless research, legal work, exposing corruption, lies, it wasn't flashy. It was the long obedience of patience, rooted in faith, of which the whole time churchgoers, family members of Brian are saying, Brian, this is going to get you killed. This is bad farming. This is ineffective in the system. This is Alabama we're talking about. But he writes, Brian Stevenson, we're all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. But simply punishing the broken, rooting it out, walking away from them or hiding them from sight only ensures that they remain broken. We all need mercy. We all need justice. And perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. In this story, Brian's patience, Walter's patience, it wasn't passive. It was perseverance. It was long-suffering. It was a refusal to fall into anger or despair and let that tell the story. It was deep trust that God is at work even when the arc is long. And because of that, a man's freed. Okay. Back to the parable. You know, the only answer Jesus gives to the problem of evil is that an enemy did it. It's frustrating. The servants have the time-old and honored question. Where did it come from? Where did evil come from? And Jesus says an enemy's done it. No explanation, no theology. The servants are totally preoccupied with the problem of evil question. How did it get there? Their first instinct is not what do we do or finding out how they should act. That's actually their second instinct. The first instinct is how did it get there? They ask him the question, hey man, didn't you sow good seeds? Because they went out and saw weeds, and now they're like, this is confusing. Where did it come from? That's what Jesus says. Oh, the enemy did it while you were sleeping. Any answer we give to the problem of where this evil comes from, and the parable gives us none more than just there is an enemy, seems to be reiterating this message that Jesus gives and that the scriptures confirm. The Bible answers the problem of evil this way, and Jesus answers it this way. God is good, but, and I grant you, it's an enormous but for some reason, he also has an enemy that makes a lot of trouble. And terrifyingly, you might be doing the handiwork on behalf and for the enemy. That's how Jesus responds to the problem of evil. And I found myself with just two questions. And I think Jesus is inviting us into two questions. First, whose side are you on? And second, whose methods will you use? That's really what it's about. Whose side are you on, and whose methods will you use in light of this problem? Mine, yours, the world's, or Jesus's? The invitation is into Jesus's method. So my last point is that the method is forgiveness. The invitation of the parable is not to judge the weeds, but to forgive. All the malice and evil and badness and terrible things in the world, in my life and in yours, are not to be dealt with by attacking or abolishing the things in people in whom it dwells. No, it's to be dealt only by aphiemi, letting go, letting be. It's a forgiveness, it's a suffering. It might even look like permission. It might look really inefficient. Probably is going to look really ineffective. It probably will be a very roundabout way from A to B. And the hard part is forgiveness can look like permission. It can look like you're giving permission. To forgive the wrongs that someone is doing can get you accused of being in the camp of the wrongdoer. How much patience does this require to grow and root and trust and wait, to bear fruit in hostile soil? But Jesus is saying the kingdom doesn't need defenders. It needs faithful presence. It doesn't really need you. Most of it's going to happen while you sleep. So, aphiemi, let them grow together. Forgive them. Jesus doesn't ignore evil, but he refuses to let it define the story. Until the harvest, judgment is not yours or mine. Okay, P.S. on judgment. As we close it up. I can hear some of you saying, oh, this forgiveness talk, Ryan. I'm itching to have you get to the fire and brimstone that's at the end of this. This hellfire and judgment that's the end, where everything's gathered up and thrown into the fire. When are we getting to that? Jesus talks about judgment for sure at the end. I think because it stresses a truth. God is in charge. He will, under whatever final circumstances, successfully and permanently erase all evil. But the great bulk of the central truth of this parable is that in the present circumstances right now, and this is the only world that you and I happen to inhabit, the mystery is that the kingdom is in charge and totally capable of moving forward on its own. And will be successful in that means of eradicating evil. All the weeds or darnel or tares or evil in the world can't lift a single finger against it. It just is. And the truth is that we don't get to pick and choose that which is metaphor and that which is literal when it's all metaphor. We don't get to, on one hand, say, oh, well, I'm not actually a seed. I'm not actually literally wheat. I'm not literally a field. And the kingdom isn't literally just a farmer who's sowing. And then it gets to the judgment part and be like, oh, no, that fire's real. That part's real. This part's figurative. That part's real. We don't get to do that. But it's our instinct, isn't it? We're drawn to that. So I'm going to give you and leave you with 4 anchors to hold you in the tension as you sit in the fire and brimstone section at the end. Jesus' language is symbolic and prophetic. It is not a literal map of hell and the end-time judgment. It's not. Just like it's not a literal description of the kingdom as being a field. The second point is that the fire may be cleansing, not tormenting. That there is option for this being refining and cleansing, not tormenting. And good theological ground to stand on, if you are believing that. The third, God's justice and love are never at odds. At the end, when he says he gathers this up and the fires happen and there's his sorting and his judgment, that is real, that he's saying, I am the judge, you aren't. It comes from a heart of mercy. And lastly, there is mystery in judgment. Just call it what it is. I don't know what this is going to be like. There's mystery there. Do you know where there is no mystery? For me, in the character of Jesus. I'm not confused on that. I don't find that to be mysterious. So as you dig into that, maybe these anchors help as a touchstone to ground you, to come back to it. When we're tempted to literalize something that is prescribing a kind of fire and brimstone that makes us uncomfortable. I'll leave you with this. I love Capon's final quote on the passage in his chapter where he's fantasizing a bit on what Jesus might have been thinking and might have been saying at the end of this parable. He says this, well, Jesus thinks to himself, I gave them the fire and brimstone stuff they were dying to hear, and I'm glad, I guess, because after all, it is a kind of truth. But, how I hate to think what they're going to do with it. Throw them just one eschatological dog biscuit like that, and they'll never stop yapping. Let me see. What do I tell them next? Probably I should get off this whole end of the world business completely. One thing's for sure, though. I'm definitely not going to say another word about these damned weeds until I'm good and ready. Jesus says, forgive them. Let them grow together. And a quote from an acquaintance of mine, a friend of David's, Mike Erie, he said to me once, I want to live as if the kingdom is slow, hidden, and unstoppable. That it doesn't rely on my moral goodness or my ability to weed the field. So this week, don't panic, don't purify, don't play judge, be present with those hurting, grow deep roots, wait well, forgive freely, affiemi. Guys, come on up. Tyler, Kirsten. I'll pray. Lord, it feels like we're wading into following Jesus 401. This is the upper level division class on what it's like to be patient, to release control, to stop striving for outcomes, to stop measuring our breadth and our impact, and to trust. Help us to hold that tension of what it is to be patient and to trust and to be those that are advocating for justice, for those hurting, for those marginalized, for those suffering. What is it like to be together and to be present in those spaces? Expand our imagination and our thoughts and our hearts to a tenderness that is yours, that is your tenderness. And remind me this week that I am not in charge and I am not the judge. Thank you that you are and that you are good. So we worship, draw us deeper into these truths and into your presence in the name of Jesus. Amen.